We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks. I'm very impressed that so many people are here bright and early on a Sunday morning. We're almost through with this exciting conference. I'm Jennifer Berkshire, and I'm going to be the conversationalist today. And I'm so pleased to be joined by Gordon Lafer. Gordon Lafer, if you don't know him, is an economist, and he is the author of this incredible book. Hold it up, Gordon. It's called The 1% Solution. And Gordon was really the first person to take a state-by-state look at all of the laws that the various corporate lobbies pushed through after the Great Recession. And as we know from our lives as teachers and parents, a lot of those laws focused on public education and the people who work in public education. So what we're going to do today is have a back and forth about what Gordon found, how it fits into the larger picture of what's happening in our political system today, where there might be some rays of hope for us to take home, and then maybe some other insights that Gordon wants to. He's been at this work for a long time, and he knows a thing or two. So, Gordon, let's start with it's 2008. The economy has gone off a cliff. You get the idea. You notice some things starting to play out in state houses. Tell us what you noticed and really how the project took shape.
Okay. It took shape more in the start of 2011 because it was the economy tanking which created a fiscal crisis in every state, which created an opening for people who wanted to destroy public schooling and many other agendas. But coupled with that was the sudden possibility of spending unlimited amounts of corporate money on politics, which was made possible by the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United in early 2010. And so the fall 2010 elections were the first elections that were run under the new rules of unlimited corporate spending. And what we started seeing with those legislatures elected then, starting in early 2011, was much more aggressive things: anti-union, anti-teachers union, privatization of education, charters, vouchers, a whole lot of things like that, and the same bills showing up in state after state after state. Many people saw this. One of the most important organization at the state level that corporate power is organized through is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which probably many of you know about. I can explain how it works. And around that same time, in 2009-10, there was a whistleblower who released thousands of documents from what had previously been very secretly guarded information about how ALEC worked into the public domain. So what we saw, all of that, you see attacks on tenure, attacks on replacing human teachers with digital applications, promotion of virtual schools, all kinds of things, all happening at the same time, and in state after state after state. Some of the tracking of figuring out where ALEC bills were coming was done by using anti-plagiarism software. I don't know how many of you use it. We get this at universities, right? You get a paper from a student, here's a thing to run it through that does string searches, right? So they did that with legislation and found, it's really, 75% the same bill being introduced in all these places. So in almost every place where this happened, where, like anything, people believed that the bills came out of the head of some local legislator or local politician and a response to particular conditions in that state. And overwhelmingly, none of that is true, that these bills are not coming from any legislator, any politician in any state. They're coming from the national headquarters of the biggest and most powerful political actors in the country, which are the big corporate lobbies: the Chamber of Commerce, the National Federation of Independent Business, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, and a bunch of other employer organizations, which we don't normally think of as being involved in education, but were, in a realm where there are thousands of organizations involved in the education debate, the most powerful actors, both controlling who gets elected to office and what they do when they're in office.
Excellent first response, Gordon. Let's go ahead and give him an early round of applause. So we're going to dig in to some of the things that you talked about and exactly what that corporate education agenda looks like. But I want to pause and go back to something that you started off with, which is just how important Citizens United was in remaking the landscape. And I'm not sure how many people are aware, but the DeVosses were incredibly instrumental in Citizens United, that they spent decades going back to the previous generation of DeVosses funding long shot lawsuits with the aim of eliminating any restrictions on soft money spending in politics. So we're at this moment where you see this array of relatively few people with all this money, and yet they seem to have a very particular vision of what the country should look like, including how people should be educated. So I wondered if you could just give us a kind of macro view of where you see what are the ideas that they're pushing, and then we'll go into some of the specific elements of the agenda.
Okay. I think in this book I've looked at a bunch of different issue areas, and education is one of them. Education policy is the place where more bills have been passed than any other domestic policy issue in the country, more than minimum wage or trade or healthcare or anything, and where there are more actors involved in the politics. And obviously there's a bill only passes because there's a coalition of people who get together. There's nobody who exercises complete control. But despite all of that, and despite the fact that there are a lot of individuals and families and ideologues involved, I think when you look at where do bills actually pass, it is where they have the support of corporations who are spending money on politics. And what is so important, I think, about looking at corporations, and if you look at the American, well, let me step back for a minute. It'll be a slightly longer answer. How many people know how ALEC works? Okay.
Well-informed audience.
Good. So, very briefly, for those of you who don't, ALEC is a combination of several hundred of the biggest corporations in the country. K-12 Inc. is in it in education. A lot of the tech companies, Facebook, Microsoft, the Gates Foundation, the Chamber of Commerce, Ford and GM, Pepsi and Coke. About a quarter of all state legislators in the country are members of ALEC. They meet 4 times a year. The legislators pay $50 a year in dues. The rest of the expenses are paid by the corporations. And they meet in committees that are made up half of elected legislators and half of corporate lobbyists, and they write model bills together. Those bills have to be approved by the corporate board of ALEC, and then they get introduced in state after state. Then the same companies that write the bills fund those candidates' campaigns, fund their own independent expenditures on broadcast and social media, and fund think tanks at the state level to put out their talking points and experts on TV. So it's a very well coordinated, very well funded 50-state campaign trying to change the country. One of the things that is so revealing about studying this is, like, when you look at individuals, right? We're so drawn to focus on the circus of whether it's Trump or even George Soros or Tom Steyer on the left, right? So individuals are ideological and can be motivated by all kinds of things. When you look at ALEC, it's several hundred of the biggest corporations that are not ideologues. Right? At some point in every one of those companies, there was a meeting of the executive committee or the government affairs committee that decided it serves our corporate interests to spend time, money, and energy trying to push forward this agenda. And so I think the critical starting point for us is trying to understand, why does Kraft Food and Coke and Walmart, what is their agenda? Why are they pushing this combination of things that we see in education? And they're pushing the whole combination. They're pushing virtual schools, they're anti-union, they're anti-tenure, they want bigger classes, they want standardized testing, they want a narrow curriculum, they want to lower the credentialing and certification requirement and training of teachers. They want to do away with the public school system. This is, usually you encounter 1 or 2 of these things in your state. This is the whole package of things, and they're being pushed by the biggest corporations who are not credentialing and certification. Who are not ideologues, right? Who somehow they think this is in their rational interest, right? So I think that we need to start with that as the first point of analysis, to look behind the politicians, to look behind Stand for Children or whatever Teach for America, whatever other 1,000,001, nicely named advocacy organizations that are there. Wow, now that's service. Thank you. You want one of these?
No, I'm good.
So actually, I already forget what the question was. But it's-
This is great because this is actually the thing that I find the most confounding, right? That on the one hand, you have this sort of menu of reform items that don't necessarily fit easily together. And it's hard for me to understand that question that you ask. Why is it in the interest of, say, craft foods to reshape, like what is the bigger picture that could make them think that these things are in their interest?
Okay. So, again, there's a lot of different things involved, and they have there are Republican operatives who want to get rid of teachers unions because they think teachers unions fund the Democrats and it's just party politics. There are rich people who want tax cuts, and for the most part, the biggest part of state and local government is education. They want to cut education so they can fund tax cuts for the rich. But I think when you look at these big companies and you say, even if you think about the attack on public employees in Wisconsin, which kind of kicked off the current era of state politics, it's not obvious. So Kraft Foods was the head of the labor committee of ALEC in that year. What does Kraft Food care about lowering wages or laying people off in Wisconsin or Ohio? It's not obvious, and we need to think about it. So I think part of what's going on is this. The people at the very top of the economy believe that America is an empire in decline, and the country's going to keep going down. They don't see it rebounding. For them, the political problem is, how do they manage the politics of decline? How do they pursue a policy agenda which is going to make the country yet more unequal, which is going to make the rich richer and the majority of people's lives materially worse off without provoking a political backlash? And I think there's several different things that they do to try to manage that. I mean, that's the essential political challenge for the real economic elite. And one of them is I think, trying to lower all of our expectations of what we think we have a right to demand just by virtue of living here, either from our jobs as workers or from the government as citizens. I work a lot in the labor movement. In union organizing, it's common for people to talk about wanting to ignite a revolution of rising expectations, right? Where if a worker has an asshole boss and they win a grievance against that person, then they feel like, whoa, I won. Maybe I'm going to get involved in the contract negotiations. And if you win a good contract, people may feel like, well, maybe I'll try to change who the mayor is. And you keep raising your sights higher. I think part of what the agenda of the corporate elite for preventing political backlash is to ignite something like a revolution of falling expectations. So if I feel like my daughter's in a class with 37 kids, which my daughter is, but at least it's out 45. Right? They only have music and art 9 weeks a year, but they still have it 9 weeks a year. Like, I don't have comprehensive health insurance. I only have catastrophic health insurance, but at least I have catastrophic health insurance, and for now I'm okay. Right? Like, I don't have any paid vacation, but I have a job and I'll have some time off between this job and my other job. Right? The more we ratchet down our expectations of what we think we have a right to expect, we normalize downward mobility, and it makes it politically safer for them. Now, when you look at it, think, what do we in America actually think we have a right to just by virtue of living here? It's very little, right? Most people don't think you have a right to health care. We don't have a right to housing, don't necessarily have a right to food and water. People think we have a right for our kids to get a decent education and a right for the mail to be delivered. And both those things are under attack. Right, and education, I think, more than anything else, right? This is almost the one remaining very big thing. There's one of these ALEC-funded think tanks. The president of it has this quote that I put in the book where he says, K-12 education is the last remaining socialist enterprise in the United States, right? So obviously, like, this is hyperbole. He's trying to whip up his troops, but in some ways, it's right? That this is a major, major public good where we tax the rich in order to provide a public benefit that you get just by right of being a citizen. When they talk about needing to do away with the entitlement mentality, the most problematic entitlement for them is not Medicare or Social Security or, like, God forbid, actual welfare, which is almost nothing now, but education. And I think education is even more of a problem for them than other things because it's not just something that you get, but the very nature of education is that teachers are trying to encourage kids to think they can do more, to raise your sights higher, to think you could be something you didn't think you could be, to think you might have a right to expect something that you didn't have in your head when you walked into the classroom. And that's dangerous. There was, some of you may know, I feel like every once in a while the truth slips out between the lips of people being not careful. There was a long time ago a guy who was a higher education advisor to Reagan and Nixon who said about higher ed, we need to be careful who we let go to higher ed, because this was a time of recession and we're going to end up with a lot of highly educated unemployed people. Right? So for people at the top who see this as a country in decline and that things are going to get worse for the majority, they think if you're going to have a lot of poor and unemployed people, the last thing you want is for them to be well educated, because then they think they have a right to something they're not getting and they might have the skills to do something about it. So I know this is like a very dark version, and it's not the kind of thing you could have scientific proof of, but essentially it's like we have a fact pattern. We see these corporations acting. We know that they think this is in their corporate self-interest. Some of them, like K-12 Inc. and Pearson, the people who are going to, and the investment banks who are going to make out like bandits from privatizing schooling, it's easy to figure out what the interest is. But the bigger corporate lobbies, why does the Grocers Association and the Retail Federation and car manufacturers support this? I think this is a key part of the answer.
Well, on that grim note, I thought you could really see what you were talking about with the recent debate over healthcare, right? That the clash is over whether people can expect anything at all. And there you feel the push to make education more like healthcare, right? That talk about access, but not the thing itself. And so I wondered if you could talk about that sort of re-envisioning of public education in the current context that we've been spending so much time at this conference talking about, which is the push to privatize, the sort of zero-sum game mentality where, like, if you just have catastrophic health insurance, that's, too bad for you. At least I have mine. So help us understand we're used to thinking of we're still very much in that mindset that people are entitled to public education. What does it look like if public education becomes more like healthcare?
I think we know the answer to this question. For one thing, we have one version of this is block grants. We have a long history of block grants going back to Reagan. We know how block grants work. In the first year or maybe the first month, the block grants are for the same amount that states or cities used to get under the old system. And by year 2 or 3, they cut, right? Make kind of, the idea that we're all going to be consumers of school choice. I'm sure I don't need to tell this to people here, right? It's like, but it's not really choice. I feel like, well, what choice do I want? I want my kid to go to the school that Rahm Emanuel's kids go to. I want my daughter to go to the University of Chicago Lab School, where they have like 1 million libraries in art and music, and they don't have standardized testing. That choice is not available. Right? That's not one of the choices. If we voucherize school, it's going to end up being like, in some ways, right, like healthcare. I don't know anybody who doesn't hate their health insurance company. But what are you going to do, right? And this is part of privatization, is that, and it's not only in schooling, but especially in schooling, right? Right now, there's a lot of shitty schools. There's a lot of shitty schools in the public system, right? And it's a huge problem. This is not just about charter schools and vouchers. There's at least somebody to be angry at when your kid is in one of those schools. When the system is privatized, there's nobody to be angry at. This is like healthcare. Who am I going to be angry at? The fact that I hate my health insurance company. Maybe I should have been a smarter consumer. Maybe I should have worked a little harder and gotten a better job with a better package. There's no place to go, right? This is part of what happens when we privatize schools, we privatize libraries, we privatize public transit, is we remove the focal point that public anger can coalesce around or make any demand to. This is another thing that makes it easy for people who are pushing an agenda of downward mobility, because it's very hard to fight back against that.
You have a great line about that in your book, about how when you remove public oversight, and we talk about this so much, about the importance of democratic control, and we think of it as a very abstract thing, but you make the point that when you remove that, basically all that's left is sort of customer service demands. And so it's like your relationship with a formerly, public community asset is basically reduced to being on the phone with Comcast. And
Yes, I don't know that I have anything to say about that.
There were a number of places in your book where I felt like you really put your finger on, you made it real in a way that the debate can seem very abstract. I feel like we're making good progress talking about your book, but I feel like for a Sunday morning, we have really taken people down a fairly bleak path. And so I'm gonna jumble up the order here, and we'll come back and revisit some of the specific bleakness of the topic. But I want you to talk about how incredibly unpopular this agenda is and why that's actually something that we can sort of make use of as we push back.
Yeah, thank you. Just to say a word about the bleakness, I don't think things are hopeless at all. But I think the truth is really is very daunting. And it's always hard. I'm sure others of you had this, or you give these kind of depressing talks. But I always feel like, take the red pill and go back to the Matrix. What are you going to do, right? This is what we're actually facing, and we need to to come up with an effective strategy. We need to aim at the actual power that is driving these things, and not at the front organization they put in front of our face. So, but to say a few things about on the more hopeful side, which is that people vote for candidates for all kinds of reasons, not necessarily the reasons that we wish they would decide on the basis of. But when people get to decide on an issue-by-issue basis, which is most often on ballot initiatives, the corporate agenda on an issue-by-issue basis is very unpopular, and unpopular across party lines. A strong majority of people want their kids in small classes. A majority of people in both parties think that standardized testing should count for 0 in teacher evaluation or tenure. Like where every place around the country we're negotiating about if it should be 30% or 70% or everything else, a majority of people in the country think it should have no role whatsoever. Overwhelming support not for decreasing but for raising teacher training standards, and for saying that every teacher should spend a year under being mentored by a more experienced teacher before they have sole responsibility in a classroom. And you see this in places where people have a chance to vote on specific laws, and I want to give you a couple of examples. One of them was Florida in 2010. So Florida had class size caps written into its constitution, and good caps like 18 kids from K to 3, and then I think it went to 24 after that. The legislature wanted to get rid of them. Because it was in the Constitution, they needed to take it to the voters. So they put it on the ballot in 2010. The legislators supported it, the voters rejected it, like 60-40. Now this was the Tea Party wave election in 2010, when Florida elected a Tea Party governor, Rick Scott, and elected a very right-wing legislature. If you do the math, several 100,000 people had to go to the polls in 2010 in Florida thinking something like, I hate government, I hate Democrats, I hate unions, but I want my kid in small classes. All right? We saw the same thing in South Dakota and Idaho, 2 very red states whose legislatures passed laws doing away with tenure, mandating quote-unquote merit pay based on test scores, and requiring kids to take an online class as a condition of graduating high school. And voters overturned all of that in referendum. Right? This is not California. This is Idaho and South Dakota. So we know that this and the rest of the program is very unpopular on a bipartisan basis. The other thing I would say is, here's another thing that I think is important, especially for everybody here who are teachers. Gallup does a poll every year where they ask the public, which of these professions do you think are ethical and trustworthy? So the bad news, anybody in here who is a union rep or a lawyer or a politician, you're like in the single digits. But school teachers are, I think, in the high 70s, like right after nurses. It's very, very high. So I think, in the current political climate, it's easy to feel teachers are so under attack. It's easy to feel like, oh, wary of speaking out because people think if I'm a teacher, that means I'm corrupt and putting my own interest ahead of the kids or something like that. But we shouldn't let ourselves be talked into that, because it's not true, and it's not what the data show. So I think there's a very fertile ground for pushing for a more humane version of education across, in places where we can make the fight be about the specific issues as opposed to about personalities or political parties.
Well, that concludes the hopeful portion of this installment. So
It wasn't bad.
well, one of the things you explained so well in the book is that because these issues are so unpopular, that's why you see such emphasis in these different states on restricting who can vote. And as people who are focused on education, we sometimes are guilty of really not seeing how education connects to these other issues. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. I think there does seem to be growing awareness. Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains, got so much attention over the summer as, she talked about sort of this vision that's so deeply suspicious of democracy.
So, I think because the corporate agenda is so unpopular, not just in education, but across the economy, it inevitably leads to needing to shrink the realm of democracy, right? And by this, so obviously part of what they're doing is voter ID and voter repression laws of not allowing felons to vote, and all kinds of things that limit the number of people who can vote. But in a different way, right? How robust a democracy is not just about if you have free and fair elections, but the realm of economic life, the realm of public life that is subject to democratic control. If you have perfectly free and fair elections and all you're allowed to vote on is the color of the flag, not so good, right? And so what they're doing is, in almost every state in the country, there are cities or counties that are more progressive than the state as a whole. Maybe not in California, but in almost every state in the country. Corporate political power is greatest at the state level, greater than either at the level of the federal government or local governments. And I could talk later about why that is. But what they're doing is using their power at the state legislature to take away from citizens at the city level the right to vote on things. So this started with passing laws saying it's illegal for any city in a state to raise its minimum wage higher than the state level. In Wisconsin, one of the first things that Scott Walker did was Milwaukee in 2009 by voter referendum was one of the first cities to create a right of everybody to a certain number of days of paid sick leave. Under Walker, the legislature retroactively abolished the Milwaukee law and made it illegal for any other city to do that. We have a slew of states now that have made it illegal for cities to create a right to paid sick leave, to create fair scheduling laws like there is in San Francisco, to create laws that make it illegal to have gender orientation discrimination on the job. There was a law passed in both Michigan and Tennessee that, because these laws get broader and broader because they're afraid of left-wing populism, right? Michigan's law, its opponents called the Death Star. It banned any change in the workplace, including creating a right to rest breaks, creating a mechanism for recovering stolen wages. All those things were banned by the legislature, right? So this is terrible, but it's also a sign of them seeing of how unpopular their own policies are and how much energy there is at the local level.
Yeah, that was great. Michigan, my favorite example, Michigan now requires people to accept a plastic bag, right? Yeah.
One more thing. It's true. I guess one thing that, that may be obvious, but that I want to comment on the connection between all these things about all these economic things and the school system. Forever, right? We all know that what almost every research shows is that the single most powerful determinant of education outcomes is wealth and poverty, right? This is what every study shows. Nothing else. The difference between charter and public schools, the difference between one form of education or another, everything is tiny compared to the difference in economics. So what we have, right, I would say, it's impossible to say, I'm against the minimum wage, I'm against food stamps, I'm against public housing, I'm against the earned income tax credit, I'm against a right to paid sick leave, I'm against the ability to recover stolen wages, and I'm laying awake at night wondering how poor children are not getting a good education and what we can do about this, right? What the corporate lobbies are doing, right? Because we need to see this is not different people. This is not just things happening. This is the same actors pushing all of this, right? Who come in, when we see them in education is when they come in and say, there's all these failing schools, right, that we declare persistently failing because their test scores are low. We know that test scores are determined above all by poverty. We have created the conditions of poverty by what we're doing in all the rest of our lobbying that you education people may not be paying attention to, right? So we see the corporate lobbies on the one hand creating the conditions of school failure or personal failure among kids who are struggling in families under these conditions, and then swooping in and say, the schools are failing, here's the answer. Charters and vouchers and tech and the rest of the stuff that they want to push. So I think it's important to see how these things fit together.
You talk a little bit in the book about prevailing wage and attacks on unions, and anyone who's in this room who is a teacher knows how effective the argument has been that's been marshaled by the right that somehow you have more than, playing you off against the other people in your communities. And you make this argument that really, the goal of going after things like pensions and healthcare that's provided through, generous healthcare is to lower the expectations in the community writ large about what can be expected and what can be demanded. And I never really thought about it that way.
One of the questions, right, that we have to think about is why are big private corporations why do they care to attack public employees and public employee unions? Here's one thing we know it's not, right? Whenever the attacks on public employees or public employee unions happen, it's put across as we're doing this in order to stand up for hardworking non-union taxpayers in the private sector, right? That's what Scott Walker said. We can no longer afford to live in a society where the public employees are the haves and the taxpayers are the have-nots, right? So this is that hardworking non-union families in the private sector are being bled dry by fat and lazy university professors and other public employees. So first of all, we know that when public employees are laid off and wages and benefits are cut, what they do with the money is not giving it to hardworking families struggling to get by in the non-union private sector. We know this in Wisconsin. Wisconsin provided $2 billion in tax cuts that were paid for by public employee layoffs and wage and benefit cuts. 60% of that went to the richest 20% of the state. The next quarter went to the next 20%, and the bottom 60% of the state had 20% of the benefits to them, right? But what we also know is that, excuse me, this is true about pensions, but also just about wages. The school systems in many, many cities are the single biggest employer. In places where a unionized public employer is the biggest employer in a local labor market or one of the biggest employers, it has a competitive effect on driving up wage and benefit standards for non-union private sector employers in the same labor market. And I can give you the example of where I live in Eugene, Oregon. The biggest employer is the University of Oregon. So let's say secretaries at the University of Oregon get health insurance because they're unionized public employees. That means that a non-union private sector employer who wants to hire secretaries needs to, if not match, at least come up towards the union standard, or else live with the knowledge that the best people are going to go work for the university if they can. So the same is true in reverse. When they cut down unions, when they undermine the wage and benefit standards in major employers, which is almost everywhere, the school system, it has a follow-on ripple effect for people who work in the non-union private sector. Most people never connect the dots, but this is part of what the corporate lobby's interest is, right? It's dangerous for them to have their non-union private sector employees know that somebody has a defined benefit pension, because everybody wants that, right? This is part of the problem of rising or falling expectations.
The one thing that I still have trouble wrapping my head around is that the corporations that sit on the boards that are driving this stuff, they still need workers. And you see this playing out in states like Kansas, where business leaders started to speak out against the devastating effects of Sam Brownback's tax cuts. In Michigan, where I've spent a lot of time, you see the Chamber of Commerce. There's an independent business federation that's casting a very wary eye in the direction of Dick DeVos's Chamber of Commerce because they see what's happened to Michigan over the last 15 years. So even if your bleak vision really does pan out, at some level, don't they need skilled workers? I mean, there's a reason why you have companies flocking to certain areas and not others.
So I'm going to give you more bleakness, and I could be, I could be adding things up wrong, right? There are certain facts that we know, and the explanation for why, you can't grab the corporate leaders and shake them awake in the middle of the night and get the truth out of them, right? We need to make the best sense we can of trying to figure out why they're doing what they're doing. But this is a question that a lot of people ask. Isn't it irrational for them to be cutting education and other public infrastructure? Because after all, don't they need these people to be their workers and also to buy their stuff, right? So obviously there's irrationality on every side. I mean, the corporate lobbies, like everybody else, figures out politics by trial and error and stumbles along, and not everything is unified. But we see a big pattern that needs to be explained. And I think that we need to recognize that our economy has changed in at least two important ways from what it was a few decades ago. One of these is the degree of globalization, right? So there was this famous, I think it was 1953, when the president of GM told the US Senate that what's good for GM is good for America. So I don't know if that was true then, but it's much less true now. It was truer, it was closer to true when GM cars were made by American workers and bought by American consumers. Now a majority of GM cars are sold overseas, and 2/3 of their employees are overseas. And this is true of many companies. If you look at who are active in ALEC and the Chamber of Commerce, that in the last couple of decades, a majority of their revenue is earned overseas, and a majority of their products are made overseas, which means, is America still important to them? Yes, but less than ever before. Right, we are more extraneous than ever before to their interests. So we're in a political era with something new, which is these companies are still the most powerful actors in our politics in determining our laws, but their interests are increasingly disconnected from the interests of society as a whole because they're less dependent on us than they ever were before. The other thing that has changed, which is a big complicated thing, is financialization of the economy, which is a word for 30 years of a progression of legal and regulatory changes that culminated in the elimination of the Glass-Steagall Act under Bill Clinton in 2000. But the most important outcome of which was that every one of the Fortune 500 companies completely reoriented their operation around primarily a fear of hostile takeover, which means they devote, in the 1960s, about 60% of every dollar of net profit was reinvested in companies, whether that was in wage increases or new technology or expansion. Now that's 10%, because all the rest of the money is going to shareholders, either share buybacks or dividends, in order to forestall the possibility of a hostile takeover. So what this means is that I think Hillary Clinton actually had something about this when she was talking about the one-quarter economy, talking to a friend of hers who was a CEO and saying, aren't these things you're doing totally short-sighted? And the CEO said, yes, they are totally short-sighted. But if I took a longer-term view and said, our profits are going to be lower for the next 3 years because they're going to be higher 10 years from now, I'd be fired. The market would punish me. Right? So there are things that may be socially irrational, even irrational for the long-term interests of the company, but for the CEOs doing it is rational, right? For the actual conditions under which they're operating. So, for all the times that it's tempting to think, I'm going to meet one of these people in power and one of these CEOs and talk to them over a cocktail and find the gold in their heart and convince them to do something else. All this is false, right? Both good people and bad people are doing the same thing because they're operating under a certain set of institutional constraints. And so, of course, some company, you have big national policies, some companies are hurt by it and wish that they had more people. But in general, corporate America is not saying we don't have enough skilled workers to do what we need. And in the teacher shortages, which are acute in Kansas and Indiana and a number of the states that have been going, that are darlings of the education reform movement, their response generally has been to lower certification requirements, right? Not to say we need to raise salaries. We need to have smaller class size. We need to re-professionalize the job of teaching in order to attract higher quality people. It's like, no, anybody who has whatever they call it, life experience, a BA, whatever it is, who knows nothing about teaching, should be allowed in the classroom. And that we need to think, right? Why is it? I mean, Kansas, Indiana, these are completely corporate-dominated legislature. Not to say there's no corporation that is against this, but why is it that the Chamber of Commerce thinks, yeah, it's okay. Kansas, you want to say anybody can go, almost anybody can go into a classroom and teach? Why do they think it's okay? I think because they have a vision that is much bleaker than mine for where they think the country is going.
But what about the skills gap? I mean, I don't know if anyone saw the XQ Super Schools special in September, but this is Steve Jobs' widow, Laureen Powell Jobs, and she has basically resuscitated the skills gap urgency language from the 80s. And so the current case for why we need to rethink public education from top to bottom is that there are these tens of thousands of jobs going unfilled because our schools were created 100 years ago along the lines of a factory model. Nothing has ever changed. And if you don't see this, then you're status quo.
Okay. So, first of all, the accusation of what is the old antiquated industrial model of education, I don't know anything that is more like the industrial model of education than like the rocket ship schools, where kids sit in teacherless classrooms in front of video game-based apps where they have to solve the math problem to cross the river or whatever the thing is, right? Where there's one way of teaching that every kid is going to do, where the pedagogy is based on one insight, which is kids seem to be bored in school but like video games, and that's our idea for how everybody is going to be taught, and where we strip the curriculum down to everything except math and literacy, and math and literacy are basically all test prep all the time. I mean, that's the model that is emerging in the venture capital and ed tech industries. It's the high profit model. It's the low expectation model for kids in poor cities. I can't think of something that is more like old school industrial mass, giant CMO chains where everything is the same across their 100 schools than that. To say briefly, in an earlier stage of life, I wrote a book about job training and the skills gap. It wasn't true then. I mean, there are lots and lots of reasons for kids to get a good education. That there's not enough tool and die makers is not one of them. I mean, I wish it were true when you have a lot of employers who say we can't get kids. Sometimes it kind of varies in the economy. Employers say we can't get kids with the right skills. You're like, oh, what skills do you need? You need them to do algebra or write paragraphs? No, we need them to show up on time, listen to orders, and understand that they have to start at the bottom and work their way up. Okay. So wanting people to be disciplined at low wages is not a skill. And if anything, for those of us in education and certainly in the labor movement, what we look for is people with bad attitudes who rebel against that kind of thing, right? So there is absolutely no evidence that there's a skills gap. And where companies need people with specialized skills, generally, they pay for it and they have their own training programs. It's a big country. You can find anything at the level of anecdote. So I'm sure you can find some companies who can't find whatever they need. But in general, that is not the problem we have. We have the reverse. The number of people who say, I work in a job that a robot could do. I work in a job that a brainless person could do. I don't get called to use the things I know. I don't get called to use my brain in my job. That is by far the bigger thing plaguing the country than that people don't have the skills for the job.
Before we open it up to questions, I want you to talk just a little bit about the research that you did about charter schools in California, because you came up with a perspective that I hadn't seen before, and you really got at how inefficiently the sector has developed and what that means for now these two competing systems.
So I'll just say briefly, I did a report that in the public interest published in April, looking at charter school facilities, at the actual construction or lease of buildings, which for most people is, as soon as you say, I'd like to talk to you about charter school facility financing, like everybody's asleep in the room because it's too boring to, but in that boringness is a lot of money. So in California, there's been $2.5 billion spent on charter school facilities. This is not the per pupil funding. So here's the basic problem. when a district wants to build a new public school, they do it with bond funding. To get bond funding, they apply to the State Department of Education, who looks at how much classroom space do you have and what's your projected population of students. If you already have enough classroom space, you can't build a new school. You're not eligible for bond funding. Charter schools don't have to go through that. So we found 450 charter schools in California that were open in places where, according to the State Department of Education, there already was enough classroom space for all the kids. Now, you might say, okay, the reason for opening charter schools is not just because we need more space, but because they provide something that's new, different, or better than what already exists. And that was the idea, the way charter schools were talked about, certainly when the original law was passed in California. But that criteria is not written into the funding programs anywhere. So we looked at how many charter schools perform better, understanding test scores are not the right metric, but they're what the state have better test scores than nearby traditional public schools that serve a demographically similar population of students, and 3/4 of them fail that. So in California and probably many other states, we have hundreds of millions of dollars going out the door completely untargeted to charter schools. And in California also, it's very, very difficult to not approve a charter application by the time they appeal to the state level. So we have a big and growing sector where there's a low bar of entry and a big train of guaranteed government funding, and of course it attracts a lot of low quality players, a lot of hucksters and scam artists and self-enriching people, and that's what we have here. There's one more thing I want to talk about before we go to questions, kind of two connected things. So one is, education is the one place where we see that corporate interests trump party interests. Education reform is the one kind of progressive issue where a lot of Democrats are on the wrong side, right? The reason for this is Wall Street and Silicon Valley, above all, right? The tech industry and the finance industry are big into education because there's a ton of money to be made. And the money to be made largely is in replacing human teachers with digital applications, right? Some of you may know there's now 4 different conferences going on every year where you have at the conference education policymakers, ed tech entrepreneurs who are like, I have an app for 7th grade geometry. I have an app to replace guidance counselors. I have an app for special ed, right? Literally everything, things I thought like special ed, I thought you cannot make an app for special ed. Turns out I was wrong, right? And the other people in the room are investment banks, venture capital, private equity, and hedge funds. Part of why they're all there is that ALEC promotes laws. There are now 5 states that have laws that mandate that entirely virtual schools have to be paid the same dollars per student as physical schools with licensed teachers, right? Which means the profit margins are enormous. How enormous they are, one of the ways you can see how enormous they are, is that a lot of these companies are trying to move their apps onto cell phone platforms because their target growth market is India and English-speaking Africa. So if you think they're going to make a profit in Ghana, how much more profit are they making even in poor cities like Milwaukee or Memphis or Washington, D.C.? So, and this is part of what has changed school board elections. My PhD's in political science. I studied urban politics. For a long time, the rule of thumb in city politics, you say, where is the money in elections? Where does money come from for elections and city politics? And it was overwhelmingly the real estate industry, because you think, what does city governments have to sell that is worth money to anybody, right? They don't control much of the economy, but they control zoning decisions. So real estate was always where the money came from city politics. In the last decade, that's changed, and a lot of money has come from the finance industry, from Wall Street, because city governments now have something else to sell, which is the school system. That's how Cory Booker got elected in Newark. I mean, we just saw the elections in LA, where $15 million spent to put pro-charter people into the LA school board. This is Democrats for Education Reform, which is Democrats for Education Reform is not parents pissed off that their kids got a bad education in public school. It's Wall Street, right? And so I guess the last thing I want to say is this. We, meaning teachers unions, people on the left, I think often are yelling at the wrong people. We're yelling at the people in front of us. We're arguing with school district officials. We're arguing with state legislators. We're arguing with like 1,000,001 different advocates, because those are the people right in front of us. We need to be fighting with the actual economic power that is driving this agenda. Right? Until we can take the fight, and I mean like a campaign to actually hurt their interests financially, to change their financial calculation, right, then the politics won't change because the enormous amount of money on that side will be the same. And we need to not be fooled into fighting the people they stand up in front of us as the front groups, but to see where this is actually coming from and have a serious strategy for taking the fight to them if we're going to save public education and a humane version of education. Thanks. Thank
you so much, Gordon Lafer. And I just want to put in another plug for Gordon's book, The 1% Solution. So we have quite a bit of time left for questions, so let's start.
I would just like to ask them, how might that, you said if we really want to push back or we need to go after the real interest, how might that look?
So I think a useful example for us to look at is the recent campaign, the recent Fix LA campaign of city employees in LA working on street repair and sewage and that kind of stuff, which you'd normally think nobody cares about this, right? And anytime public employee unions make a public campaign, it's like teachers, nurses, and firefighters is all anybody wants to talk about, right? What they did in LA was they said, look, when the city of LA comes to us or the county of LA and says we don't have any money, they might be lying a little, but basically they're telling the truth. One of the reasons in LA they're telling the truth is that at the height of the economy crash, they got loans, they got financing with usurious interest rates from Mellon Bank in New York. And the city of LA is now spending more to finance its debt to Mellon Bank than it's spending on its street repair or its sewer system, right? Which means that sewage is backing up, primarily in poor neighborhoods. There's all kinds of public health problems because they're not hiring enough people. So instead of campaigning against the government in LA, the union said, our campaign is to get LA to renegotiate its debt with Mellon Bank. They took trash and sewage and dumped it on the offices of Mellon Bank, right? They said this is the enemy, right? Which also means this is a strategy that can unite a broad public. This is not public employees versus the public and the taxpayers, right? That's a losing fight, and is also it's not that, the problem is we need more money to come out of the pockets of people who live in LA. This is where the money is, and this is where the political power is. So exactly what that would look like in education, we'd need to figure out, but I think there's some good examples to try to figure it out based on.
And there are actually education-related examples. There are some unions that are doing what's called bargaining for the common good, where they're doing something very similar. So the Chicago Teachers Union has really called attention to what's happened with the debt and broadening out the focus beyond just here's how much teachers should be paid, et cetera. And where it's worked pretty well. In the back with the green sleeve.
Yes, you've implied that late-stage capitalism, I call it vulture capitalism, is running scared, and that the corporations fear a hostile takeover. Could you talk about possible ways in which large-scale movements to not only address the problems in the institution of schooling, which is the last vestige of the public at this point in time, but what would it look like to really build a mass movement to challenge the fact that capitalism isn't sustainable? I mean, we're now at near imperialism in a way with globalization. So could you speak to that?
That's a softball question.
I don't have like the 4-point plan, and there's probably a lot of people in this room who have as good answers to that as I do. But just a few things that I can say. One is, I think it's important to not be too depressed. Right, we're living in Trump's America, but we're also living in the America that came close to elected Bernie Sanders on an unprecedentedly left-wing populist program, and that all the people who voted for him, including some people who voted for Trump who otherwise would have voted for Sanders, it's still that country too. The best I can say is that we do much better campaigning around issues maybe Bernie Sanders was an exception, but in general, campaigning around issues. And I would say even to the extent that you can convert candidate elections, like school board elections, to say, here's what we're going to do. We support everybody who supports these 3 things, and make them about issues. I mean, the Democrats are hardly God's gift to working people, and So the extent we can do that, I think there's much more power in that. That's not a, sorry, I don't have more than that. But.
Grace Lee Boggs, The Next American Revolution.
As you talk about going after the real people who are behind this agenda, many of us who are watching what's going on in Puerto Rico are aware that it's mirroring New Orleans very, very closely, and that the debt crisis in Puerto Rico is a capitalist agenda. Can it work there? Strategies? I mean, if we could make an impact there in our favor, particularly in terms of education and that, but although the entire island is in crisis. So can you see a vision for addressing it there? Because that's one that's staring us right in the face.
Yeah, I think Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine, from whenever that was, a decade ago or something, right, talks about how any crisis, whether a natural disaster or a fiscal crisis, will be used for radically remaking the economy by people in power. I think there's an alternative way to push for us too. I think that one of the things that happened in Katrina is that all the ideas about the culture of poverty were suddenly wiped away. Right? The big problem for the Bush administration then, I think, is that they were confronted with a whole lot of poor people who were destitute, obviously for no fault of their own. Right? It was the one moment when they couldn't say, this is because of like drugs or broken families or blah, 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 all that crap, right? And if you'd polled the country then, in like the week after Katrina, and said, what should happen to these people? I think almost everybody would have said, well, they should get a place to live, and they should get health care, and they should get food, right? Because what are you going to say, right? I think that is the number one reason why the Bush administration needed to make those people disappear and essentially disperse them around the country in little bits and pieces until the FEMA money ran out. Because that was the political problem for them, was like the specter of Sweden in New Orleans, right? Because there were, now, if we could have pushed in that direction, I think there was, I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, but can we take a crisis like the crisis in Puerto Rico and make those kind of demands? I mean, I'm talking to the building trades unions too, right? You mentioned prevailing wage, which almost nobody knows, but is a law that says publicly funded construction has to pay the going rate. It can't just pay the lowest rate you can get. In New Orleans, the Bush administration got rid of the prevailing wage rate after Katrina, so most of New Orleans was rebuilt using horribly exploited guest workers from overseas, from South Asia. In Houston and in Puerto Rico, right after something like this, nobody has a job and nobody has a place to live. You could put those two things together and say, we want to put a lot of people back to work reconstructing all the things that were destroyed, but we have to do it at a living wage. Otherwise, they're going to have to leave Puerto Rico. They can't stay there. So I don't want to be like it's easy, there's some obvious formula, but I think there's an opening for us to try to be more radical in our own way in the wake of a disaster like that.
Well, I just want to ask you a follow-up question to that, because the Puerto Rico and the school stuff is so connected in that you see that the hedge funders who own all the debt and who've been wringing Puerto Rico dry are also our biggest funders of charter school expansion. And this, this seems so obscure, but it's such an example of what you were talking about, targeting the people who are really driving this, and that you can't on the one hand be claiming to, want to lift up needy kids and then be immiserating an entire population. So is there, how can we talk about that in a way that ties things together without sounding like loons?
First of all, thank you for being one of the people who publicized that fact that of the connection between the hedge funders investing in charter schools and debt in Puerto Rico. I think that was very important. Somebody I talked to who had spent a lot of time fighting plant closing in Michigan and the upper Midwest in the 1980s said they tried to develop early warning systems for when you could tell plants might close, and one of them was when companies no longer wanted to pay their taxes, because they felt like, we don't care anymore what happens to the school system or the public health infrastructure or the roads or whatever in Michigan, because we're pulling out. And I think that what we're seeing now is a lot of companies acting that way towards the country as a whole, right? That America is a distressed property. Puerto Rico is an extreme, as a colony essentially, is an extreme version of that there is a plan to make money, but there's no real plan to rebuild that. So I don't, this is kind of the same as your question. How do we say we're not a distressed property? And with that, but we need to be clear that is their vision, and it's to a large degree in many places a bipartisan vision, unfortunately. So, but it's very unpopular, right? Both in the schools and the general rebuilding.
How about back here? In New York State, the board that governs charter schools just voted to allow charter schools to certify public school teachers. So essentially, teachers will be certified to the charters and then be certified to teach everywhere. So with much less training, if they go from 160 to 30 hours, they don't have to have a master's degree. The person certifying them doesn't have to have a teaching certificate. Since this is such a tactic of the reform, have you seen something similar play out in other states, and how did it play out?
That's not really accurate. That's actually what they did was the subcommittee, the charter subcommittee for the Board of Regents approved the certification of charter school teachers in charter schools. They will not be certified to
Yes,
teach
they
in
will.
public
They will be certifying. They will be certifying teachers, and that certification will be New York State teaching certification.
I think that's
So I don't know the specifics on this, and I haven't heard before of charter schools certifying teachers for the public school, but there are many states that have lowered certification criteria.
Teachers that are working in the charter school.
I understand.
Take that outside.
So there are many states that both exempt either all or much of the charter school teaching corps from certification criteria, and many other states that are just adopting laws that have new, alternative routes to certification. If you have a BA in the subject area, you're certified. If you have, Wisconsin now has life experience certification. I don't know exactly what counts for that. So there's definitely a lot going in that direction. One of the things that I think would be good and hard to do is I think almost every parent in the country thinks teacher certification should be really stringent, should be more stringent. And many people who go through, I feel like I'm in that camp. And yet, I have plenty of friends who are teachers who say, well, half the time I spent in teacher certification was a waste of time, right? And so I feel like it's up for us, for people who actually believe in real public education, to kind of meet the parents and say, like, well, what kind of training should teachers have? Like, without having to defend the things that are like shitty or bureaucratic or not actually useful in our own system. And we, to some degree, have the same problem in the public school system, right? And I'll say this from the labor movement. Teachers unions, both NEA and AFT, I think are kind of schizophrenic about, do they want to kill charter schools or do they want to organize them? And I understand both of those impulses, but part of it is, if we want to organize a lot of support among parents and among the community, we need to be able to say, here's the line that distinguishes a decent school from a crappy school that no kid should be sent to. We know that a bunch of those crappy schools are going to be unionized public schools, right? The program can't be no changes, everything's fine, no changes needed, right? That can't be the program, right? So we need to have a way to say, yeah, there's a lot of underfunded, crappy schools in the public sector, and here's what we think should happen to them. But essentially, here's the standards that we demand for all kids. It's easy to say in a slogan, but to actually say in an operational way, here's the kind of school we would not organize. Here's the kind of school we think should not be funded. Here's the minimum thing we think kids should get. Maybe we don't have it yet in all the public schools, but we're working towards this standard. Like, we need something like that to organize parents around. And I think the work of doing that has to come from teachers, just like the work of saying what kind of training should teachers have has to come from teachers and not wait for somebody else.
Hi, I wanted to say something really quickly and then to ask a question. I work at Center for Popular Democracy, which is a part of the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools. And so, speaking to the issue about movement building, the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools is an alliance of both teachers unions, SEIU, 4 community organizing networks, and 3 policy shops that takes on exactly what you're talking about. And it promotes the idea. I did a workshop yesterday, I don't know if anybody was there, of community schools, and there's a long explanation about what they are as that sort of bulwark. That this is what we want, and so to have a vision to fight against privatization. So anybody who wants to hear any more about that should talk to me. I have cards, but the question I wanted to ask is really sort of different. I read Nancy McLean's book, and I'm glad that you raised it. And you were saying, Gordon, that there's no evidence that this is what they want. But in Nancy McLean's book, she cites all this evidence from this trove of archives of this guy, James Buchanan, and, you know, quotes from these secret meetings that the Koch brothers and all the, that actually tell this story, that this dire picture that you're painting is what they want, and that they're trying to do it, you know, secretly. And so could you speak to that?
First of all, I think Nancy McLean's book, Democracy in Chains, is a great book, which I also would recommend to people. You know, I think there are people who are more or less ideologically conscious. When we look at all of those hundreds of the biggest corporations in the country that are involved in ALEC, you know, the vast majority of the people making those decisions have not read James Buchanan. They're not libertarians. They don't have an ideology. Some of them even, you know, when you go back, one of the things that I put in the book, there's also one of these moments where I think something revealing comes out, was in the fight over Clinton health care, right? And then, as with Obamacare, a lot of people say, why do big corporations oppose this? Because they're competing against Japanese and European companies whose workers' health insurance is paid for by the state. And so, like, you know, GM has a higher cost producing a vehicle because because we don't have nationalized health insurance. Isn't this in their interest? And in the early 90s, William Kristol, one of the big conservative visionaries or whatever, sent out a memo to all the Republicans saying, here, the danger with some moving towards national health care is not that it will fail, but that it will succeed. He said, we just had the Reagan-Bush years of discrediting the idea that the government is what secures life for families. And now we're going to put into people's heads that you can tax the rich and give yourself health care. And this is a dangerous idea, right? I think that there are a lot of corporate actors who, in some level in their bones, without being ideologically or intellectually sophisticated, get that. We don't want to put into people's heads the idea, if you can tax the rich and give yourself health care, then maybe you could do that with streets and libraries and public transit and schools. It's a dangerous idea. So I think that I think that rather than focusing on the threads of intellectual history and ideas, we need to follow the money and think about people who are not intellectuals, but who can figure out their interests enough, because that's what the vast majority of that is. That's what the vast majority of that money's up. The venture capitalists who are pushing education technology and pushing all these apps, they're not libertarians. Venture capital has an average rate of return of 15%. They don't care what you do inside a school as long as it makes 15% return. Right? And we need to understand this is not we're not up against an ideology, we're up against a market, we're up against a business that will seek ceaselessly to expand, that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to ceaselessly expand, profit for themselves and their shareholders, and so I think it's very important to be clear-eyed about that.
We still have a couple minutes left. Mercedes? I just wanted to make a comment about the difference between what's going on in Puerto Rico right now and what happened into New Orleans during Katrina, is that when Katrina hit, social media communication was not as sophisticated as it is now. And that's very powerful. Yes, what's going on in Puerto Rico is wrong, but when Katrina hit, there was no cellular connection. I had to carry my phone around with me, hoping to get a phone call from a relative. I was in Indiana for weeks, and days would pass, and I couldn't get a phone call. Now with Puerto Rico, immediately, as it was happening, people were tweeting what's going on in Puerto Rico with pictures, and that's very powerful. And so if you feel, this is too big, I don't know what to do, I don't know who to connect with, start with publicizing and spreading the message of what's going on in these places, and spreading the message of the man behind the curtain, so to speak, that, it's not just the local issue, it's the funding of the charter schools and the connection with the debt. And you inform people, because that's a real aha, wow, I didn't get that moment. And it takes a second to tweet, and that gets out there. ALEC was around since 1973, and their power was in being hidden, okay? And when it really hit in 2012, that's when I started getting involved in ed reform. My first interview was on ALEC, because I went through the documents that had been made public, and all of a sudden this organization that had been around since I was 6, I'm 50 now, the curtain was pulled back and these corporate sponsors were fleeing because they were like roaches running when the light was turned on. Okay? And so I just wanted to make a comment. Use that social media. When you find these articles about who's really driving this with the money, put it out there. And you'll also be able to make connections through the social media of organizations who are trying to do something about it.
Thank you, Mercedes.
You're welcome.
How about in the front row?
I think all the Puerto Ricans should move to our swing states. But also, I just heard or read, and I don't know the details, that the New Jersey teachers unions are supporting the Republican candidate because the Democrat candidate had previous locked himself in with Christie against their pension, and I think retirement, I forget, had really done a tune on teachers with Christie, and their message to him is, I don't care what party you're in, you screwed us and we're not voting for you. I'm wondering, how dangerous is that? Then we have a Republican legislature in New Jersey. I don't even know how much of it is true. It's just something I heard and I thought, wow.
So that is true. I don't have any details. I'm sure I don't know if there's anybody in the room who's from New Jersey. I don't have an answer to that question, but I would say that I think there is tremendous potential in reaching out to Trump voters on education. That the reason Betsy DeVos is so loathed isn't just because she's hated harder by progressives, but because the animus against her is bipartisan, and so deciding whether or not to back Republicans is a sort of squeamish question of one order, but figuring out how to talk and win back people who maybe voted for Trump but believe in small class sizes and don't want vouchers and really are appalled by virtual schools, does seem like there's a lot of opportunity for conversation there. I think we have time for one more question in the corner.
You mentioned the pressure that CEOs are under to make short-term returns. Is there space for shareholder activism on these issues against those corporations, given the distribution of their people who own their shares are often pension funds?
I think it's something that needs to be looked at more. I mean, even like CalPERS is the biggest pension fund and the biggest investment fund in the country, but there's a lot of restrictions on the extent to which both worker control over their own pension funds and then your ability to use pension funds in any way other than generating the highest return is not entirely constrained, but is one of the reasons why there hasn't been more of that. So yes, I think it's worth looking at, and there have been some cases where it's been useful, but it's not easy.
Thank you so much, Gordon Lafer. For people who have not encountered you before, where can they find more of your work in addition to the book? And I don't think you've taken Mercedes' advice and taken to Twitter. Is that correct?
No. I've been avoiding Twitter, but I got convinced to create a website that's my name, that's gordonlafer.com. So that's, for now, the cheapest place you can buy the book, too, 40% off, and has some other stuff on it as well.
Thank you so much, Gordon, and thanks to everybody for coming out on this Sunday.